Devlin Osei was 39 years old the Tuesday morning. A man in a gray suit knocked on the door of the apartment he had lived in for 6 years and handed him a notice to quit, a formal eviction notice, properly filed, citing lease violations and non-payment of a disputed utilities charge, signed by a property management company called Meridian Residential Partners, and delivered with the particular professional indifference of someone who believed he was simply doing his job. Devlin took the papers. He thanked the man. He closed the door. He stood in the hallway of the apartment for a moment, holding the notice, and he read it with the unhurried attention of a man who understood legal documents, not because he was an attorney, but because he had been reading the language of property for 16 years and knew precisely what a notice to quit was designed to accomplish, and precisely what rights it could and could not override. He was a general contractor by visible trade. He drove a truck with a magnetic sign on the door for his small renovation company, which operated out of a rented office in the East Side neighborhood of Richmond, Virginia, and billed modest middle-market clients for kitchen work and bathroom work and the occasional full interior gut. He wore a tool belt to job sites. He ate lunch from a cooler. His wife's colleagues at the architecture firm where she worked as a senior associate described him, when the subject arose, as handy. What Meridian Residential Partners did not know, what no one in that company had verified before accepting the management contract, was that the building they managed was owned through a holding company whose sole member was Devlin himself. He had just been served an eviction notice on his own property. The man who had handed him that notice was going to have a very educational morning when he spoke to his supervisors. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light came into the apartment from the east, through the tall windows in the front room that Devlin had replaced himself 4 years ago. Double-hung, historically proportioned, sourced from a salvage operation in Fredericksburg, and installed over a long October weekend with the patience that came from understanding that a window either fit correctly or it did not, and that the difference was in the preparation, not the installation. The light came through clean now, the way it had not come through before, and he had noted this every morning since, and found it quietly satisfying in the way that completed work was always quietly satisfying. He was a man who fixed things. That was the simplest way to describe the 16 years of professional life he had built in Richmond, beginning as a carpenter's apprentice at 22, working through every trade discipline over the following decade, eventually establishing his own renovation company, and then, in the years alongside and after that, building something considerably larger in the background that he had kept invisible not out of any strategic design, but out of the plain habit of a man who had been taught that good work spoke for itself and required no announcement. His father, Winston Osei, had been a building inspector for the city of Richmond for 31 years, and he had walked Devlin through every kind of structure the city contained before Devlin was old enough to drive, explaining what was sound and what was compromised and what looked solid from the outside and was hollow underneath. Winston had told him once, on a Saturday visit to a property that had failed inspection for concealed foundation damage, "Son, the building always tells you the truth. People dress things up. Buildings just settle." He had died at 67 of a heart condition that had announced itself too late, the year Devlin turned 32, and there was not a walkthrough of any structure that did not carry his father's voice somewhere in it. He had met Celeste Armand 5 years ago at a historic preservation gala in Church Hill, where he had been present as a member of a preservation society whose interests were, at that point, both civic and financial, and where she had been the most striking person in the room in the unself-conscious way of people who are not managing their attractiveness, but simply occupying it. She was an architect with opinions about fenestration and a deep preference for original materials over reproduction work, and their first conversation had lasted an hour and covered the restoration ethics of a specific Church Hill row house in enough technical detail that both of them had arrived, by the end of it, at a mutual respect that was the most honest foundation a relationship could have. He had proposed in the second year, in the front room of this apartment. On the evening, he finished the window installation, and the light first came through correctly, and she had said yes with the warmth of a woman who understood what it meant when a man chose the right moment. He had found her entirely worth building for. The change had come, as it always came, in increments too small to name at the time, but too consistent to dismiss in retrospect. A reduction in the texture of conversation. A habit, developed in the third year, of spending her evenings on work she did not describe in the detailed way she once had. A distance at dinner that had the quality of performed normalcy, present, correct, and slightly too smooth, the way a patched wall looked fine until the light caught it at the right angle and showed you the seam. She was at her desk in the second bedroom when the knock came that morning, working, or presenting the appearance of working. He had not told her about the notice when he closed the door. He had simply stood in the hallway and read it again and let the shape of it settle into his understanding. On his desk in the front room, beneath a stack of project files, sat a property management folder he had not opened in several months. The one that contained the operating agreement for his holding company and the list of properties under Meridian's management contract. He had signed that contract 2 years ago. He had not thought about Meridian since. He thought about them now. He did not show the notice to Celeste. Instead, he set it on the desk and made coffee and sat in the front room in the early morning light and thought about the shape of what had just happened. A notice to quit was a legal instrument. It required a filing, a property address, a lease reference, and a signature from an authorized agent of the property owner or the property owner's designated manager. Meridian was his designated manager. They had no authority to file against a tenant without cause, and they certainly had no authority to file against the building's owner, which meant they had been instructed to file by someone who either did not know who owned the building or who was counting on Devlin not knowing that the authority trail led back to him. His face remained perfectly calm. He picked up the notice and went through it line by line with the eye of a man who had read building contracts for 16 years. The filing was made in the name of Meridian Residential Partners. The lease violations cited were 2: a disputed utilities overage from 3 months prior and a noise complaint from a neighboring unit filed 6 weeks ago. Neither of these citations had been communicated to him before this notice. Neither had followed the standard notice cure protocol that any legitimate property manager was required to follow before escalating to a quit notice. Someone had asked Meridian to skip the process. He photographed every page of the notice. He forwarded the images to his own email. He opened the holding company's property management file and pulled Meridian's contact records and the original management contract, which specified, on page 4, that no eviction action could be initiated without the express written approval of the holding company's sole member. No such approval had been sought. He sat with this for a long moment. Then he went further to the holding company's accounting records, which his bookkeeper filed monthly. He reviewed the prior 10 months of statements with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who was no longer looking at them as routine documents, but as evidence. What he found there was not dramatic. It was consistent. There had been 8 calls to the management company over the prior 4 months from a number registered to Celeste's architectural firm, calls of between 6 and 22 minutes duration, always made between 10 and 2 on weekdays, always when Devlin was confirmed to be on job sites across the city. 8 calls. 4 months. He had not authorized any communication between Celeste and his property management company. There was no professional reason for such communication to exist. He built the timeline with the care he brought to everything that needed to be built carefully, noting each call date against his own site visit calendar, against the 3-month gap between the noise complaint and his first knowledge of it, against the dates of the disputed utilities charge, which, when he reviewed the building's actual utility billing records, did not correspond to any actual overage. The dispute had been manufactured. The complaint had been filed. The notice had been served. She had been planning something, and she had used his own management company to do it. He opened a folder on his laptop. He labeled it simply Meridian. Then he picked up his phone and called the one man he trusted to understand the complete picture in a single conversation. He met with his attorney, Clarence Webb, the following morning in Webb's office on East Main Street in downtown Richmond. Clarence was 61 years old, a property and business law attorney who had handled Devlin's holding company matters since the company's founding, and who had, over 15 years, developed the complete picture of Devlin's real estate interests, with the careful familiarity of someone who had watched them grow from one investment property to a portfolio of 11 buildings across the city and the surrounding counties. Clarence read the notice to quit with his reading glasses on and his expression unchanged. Then he set it down and looked at Devlin across the desk. "They filed against you in your own building." "Yes, without the written approval the management contract requires." "Yes." Clarence removed his glasses. "The question," he said carefully, "is whether Meridian was negligent or directed." "Directed," Devlin said. "I have phone records showing 8 calls from my wife's work number to Meridian's management line over the past 4 months. I have the filing date cross-referenced against my own site schedule. I have the utilities overage, which doesn't exist in the actual billing records." Clarence was quiet for a moment. He looked at the notice again, then at the property management contract Devlin had brought, open to page 4. "The violation of this provision alone voids their authority to file," he said, "independently of who directed them." He folded his hands. "But if the direction came from your wife, and if she was attempting to create a pretext for your removal from the marital residence, which is what this building is, then the implications for any dissolution proceeding are considerably broader." Devlin nodded. He had arrived at this conclusion the previous evening. "There's more," he said. He placed the accounting records on the desk, the bookkeeper's summaries for the prior year, with specific line items flagged. 3 payments to a firm called Armand Design Consulting, totaling $22,400, that had been routed through the holding company's operating account and coded as renovation consultation fees. Devlin had not contracted any such work. Armand was Celeste's family name. The firm, which his attorney's paralegal had identified in a 2-hour search that morning, was registered to a relative of Celeste's, a cousin who operated a small interior design practice, but whose banking arrangements, upon further review, funneled those payments back toward a personal account Clarence's office had flagged as potentially co-mingled. $22,400 run through his own company. Without his knowledge, Clarence picked up his pen. He did not flinch. "We respond to Meridian today," he said. "We put them on notice of the contract violation and the full chain of ownership. That stops the eviction process immediately." He paused. "And then we begin a different conversation. Tools were meant to work, not shine. His father's buildings had always told the truth. So had his records. He drove out to Hanover County on a Saturday to see his Uncle Jerome, who was 72 and had been a property assessor for the county for 28 years before he retired, and who lived in a house he had built himself on a piece of land his family had owned since 1931. Jerome was a spare man, with the unhurried physicality of someone who had spent his professional life walking land and reading it. who understood property the way some men understood music, as a language with its own grammar. They sat on the back porch in the late afternoon sun with sweet tea and the comfortable silence that had always characterized their time together, the kind of silence that did not require filling. Jerome listened to everything. He did not interrupt. When Devlin finished, the older man was quiet for a long while. He looked at the yard, the old oak at the far end that his grandfather had planted, the garden his wife kept along the fence line, the shed he had built himself from materials salvaged from a barn demolition 20 years ago. "She tried to use your own house to put you out of it," Jerome said. "My own building," Devlin said. "Yes," Jerome nodded slowly. "Your father assessed a property once. A man had been paying taxes on a piece of land for 30 years under the honest belief that he owned it. Turned out the deed had been filed incorrectly at the start, and someone else held the legal title the whole time." He turned and looked at Devlin with the steady regard of a man who had spent 3 decades watching ownership disputes unfold in real time. "Your father used to say that most people never look at the deed. They look at who's living there and assume that's the whole story." "She looked at who was paying rent," Devlin said, "and assumed that was the whole story. And the deed says otherwise." "The deed says otherwise." Jerome set his tea down. "Then the deed wins. It always wins. That's what deeds are for." He looked back at the yard. "Don't let her take your dignity out of this. The documents are going to say what they say. You don't need to add anything." Devlin drove back to Richmond that evening along the 2-lane roads that ran through the county, past the farmland and the tree lines and the occasional old house set back from the road in the way of structures built to last rather than to be seen, and he thought about deeds and what they meant, not just as legal instruments, but as a record of intention, of the work a person put into a thing before anyone else arrived to claim it. By Thursday, Clarence's office had served Meridian with a formal cease and desist and notified them of the complete ownership chain, including the holding company's formation documents and Devlin's status as sole member. The eviction action had been voided within 24 hours. Meridian's managing director had called Clarence's office on Thursday afternoon and had been, by all accounts, a man who had just understood the full scope of the situation he had been placed in. Clarence had obtained, through Meridian's disclosure, the email chain that had initiated the eviction filing. The direction had come from a personal email address registered to Celeste. The email had described the tenant as a non-paying occupant of uncertain lease status and had requested that Meridian proceed with the most expedient available action. It had made no mention of the ownership structure. She had represented to his own management company that he was an unauthorized occupant of his own building. Real power was in the record. It always had been. The reckoning came not in a courtroom, but in a conference room on the 6th floor of Clarence's building on a Thursday morning in February, arranged at the request of Celeste's attorney, a woman named Patricia Holt, who had taken the case with the confidence of someone who had not yet seen the full chain of title documentation and who arrived, Devlin noted, with a considerably more measured expression than she had perhaps intended. Celeste was already seated when Devlin and Clarence arrived. She wore the composed expression she brought to professional settings, precise, unreadable. The expression of a woman who had decided before entering the room that composure was her best available strategy. Clarence placed the first document on the table and slid it to the center. It was the holding company's formation filing, 11 years old, predating the marriage, listing Devlin Osai as sole member. Celeste looked at it without expression. The second document was the property registry for the building, the deed, filed with the city, showing the holding company as owner of record. Devlin watched Celeste's eyes move across the page and find his company's name and register what that meant with the particular stillness of a person receiving a fact that disrupts a load-bearing assumption. The third document was the management contract with Meridian. Open to page 4, with the approval requirement highlighted. The fourth document was the email chain. Celeste's email to Meridian, her language about the tenant, her request for expedient action on a date Devlin could account for, precisely because he had been on a job site in Chesterfield County that day from 6 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. Patricia Holt reviewed the chain without speaking. The fifth document was the accounting summary. The $22,400 in payments routed through the holding company to Armand Design Consulting, flagged and annotated by Clarence's forensic accountant with the banking trail that traced the funds. Celeste's composure had held through 4 documents. It did not hold through the fifth. She looked up at Devlin. It was the first time she had looked at him directly since he had entered the room, and in her expression was the particular quality of a person who has constructed a plan on the assumption that the person they are planning against does not know what they know, and has just discovered that assumption was wrong at every level. "You own it," she said, very quietly. "I have owned it," he said, "for 9 years. He said it with the same evenness he said everything. No drama, no triumph, simply the statement of a documented fact. "Since before I met you, since before we were married. The prenuptial agreement you signed covers the holding company and all its properties as premarital assets." He paused. "The eviction notice was voided on Monday. The Meridian contract will be reviewed by their legal team." Patricia Holt leaned toward her client and spoke briefly and quietly. Celeste did not respond to her attorney. She continued looking at Devlin. She tried the only move she had left. "I was trying to protect myself," she said. "I didn't know how else. You directed a company to file a fraudulent legal action against me," Devlin said, "in my own building, using my own management company. And you moved $22,000 through my business accounts in a way that my forensic accountant has documented in full." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "There is nothing here that I am unclear about. And there is nothing here that the record does not support. Your attorney has everything she needs to advise you on the terms of what comes next." He stood. He picked up the notice to quit from the table, the original, which Clarence had retrieved from the filing, and he looked at it once, the way he looked at a defective piece of material before setting it aside. Then he set it back down on the table, squarely in the center, where it belonged. He walked to the door. He did not look back. Some buildings told you the truth. Some people did, eventually, whether they intended to or not. 12 months had passed like a long exhale by the time Devlin stood in the gut renovation of a 4-unit building on North Side that he had purchased in the spring and had been rebuilding in the evenings and on weekends with the methodical patience of a man who understood that the work had its own schedule and rewarded exactly the attention you gave it. The dissolution had been finalized in September. The prenuptial agreement had governed the asset division with the clean finality of a correctly poured foundation. The $22,400 had been recovered through the dissolution proceedings, documented and credited to the marital estate calculation. Celeste's architectural firm had declined to renew her senior associate contract in the spring, a decision that had more to do with the particular attention that a formal legal inquiry drew to billing irregularities than to any action Devlin had taken directly. He had not taken any action directly. He had simply produced the record and let the record be what it was. Patricia Holt had told Clarence, in a post-settlement conversation that Clarence had relayed without emphasis, that Celeste had genuinely not known who owned the building. She had believed, based on the management company's public-facing materials, that Meridian held the property under a corporate owner she had not investigated further. She had found an opening and moved through it without reading the deed. His father had been right about that, too. Meridian Residential Partners had terminated their management contract with the holding company and had settled a separate professional liability matter without going to trial. Devlin had moved the portfolio to a different management firm, one he had vetted personally, this time with the particular attention of a man who had learned the value of knowing exactly who was speaking in his name. He had met Winifred at a historic preservation board meeting in Church Hill the previous March, where she had presented a proposal for the adaptive reuse of a deteriorating warehouse that he had been watching for 2 years and quietly considering. She was a structural engineer with the specific intelligence of someone who understood both what a building was and what it could become, who looked at failing structures with a combination of respect and confidence that distinguished people who genuinely knew their craft from people who had learned to describe it. She was in the building now, on the 2nd floor, reviewing the floor system with the focused attention she brought to everything, and she had already identified 2 things he had missed, and he had written both of them down. He ran his hand along the exposed brick of the stairwell, original, 1908. Solid and honest and exactly what it claimed to be. Nothing hidden, nothing dressed up. Just the materials and the work and the truth of both. He had built everything worth keeping. He intended to keep building. The brick under his hand was solid. The morning was clear. The work was waiting. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.